Hey everybody, this is my 20-gallon open-topped office tank, and it is in need of a water change, and I am going to be doing that later this evening probably, but that will be a separate video. This video is going to be my final thoughts on my discussion about air stones. Now, you are certainly welcome to keep the conversation going and add any input or ask any questions or whatever. But for my part, I'm not going to be shooting any more videos talking about air stones after this one. I've shot a video recently where I said some information that was incorrect. I shot a video yesterday where I corrected that information. But in it, I also left a lot of other information out and was kind of vague about a few topics. And I did that for a reason. And the reason is one of the things I actually left out of that video was when I started doing the research about gas exchange and its relation to surface tension and that sort of thing. I found out very quickly that gas exchange and this whole process that I'm talking about in very simplistic terms is actually a really, really complex and complicated process that is very, very much over my head. I started reading and doing some research and very quickly realized I am so far out of my depth as far as what all these people are talking about that I decided I was going to. I honestly did mean to mention that in my other video, which is why I was keeping it as sort of vague as possible. I don't want to really get into talking about too many details about this kind of stuff because I don't understand it fully. And I don't want to give out bad information based on what I think I might understand or so on and so forth. And so I didn't go into too much more detail about the bubbles in the water column and that sort of thing. But one of the points that was brought up was when I corrected myself in saying that it's not the bubbles that you see in the water column, it's actually the surface tension being broken, and it is specifically the surface tension being broken from below that makes air stones so efficient at gas exchange. So the first thing that was pointed out was if these bubbles are dissolving into the water, which they are, doesn't that increase the oxygen levels in the water? And my assumption is that it does. If an air bubble dissolves into the water, then whatever gases were in that air bubble, the nitrogen, the oxygen, and the carbon dioxide, are all dissolving into the water. But I don't know what that does. I don't know what impact that does. I'm assuming it increases oxygen levels, but it also increases CO2 levels. I don't know how fast those gases that are dissolving into the water would then off gas and, just sort of basically weep right out of the surface of the water. I don't know. There was just so many aspects of it that got so much more complicated than I ever imagined. I mean, right down to how do you actually define the surface of the water when you get down to a molecular level and you've got water that's evaporating off and you've got gases that are dissolving in. Where does that line stop between where it's water versus when it becomes atmosphere? So again, questions like that, it gets really complicated when you start talking about gas exchange, which ions are present, the polar charge on those ions, the pH, the water pressure, the atmospheric pressure. All of these things have an impact on what's going on with gas exchange in your aquarium. So again, I just didn't want to really get into talking about this stuff that I don't remotely understand. I mean, I get the basics of it. I understand that excess CO2 comes out of our tank, and when oxygen gets depleted in the water, and there's lots of oxygen in the atmosphere, that oxygen will go down into the water. I understand the basics of it, but that's about where my understanding of the gas exchange ends. And so I felt that it was sufficient to say that a simple air stone is going to be your most effective way at keeping your tank aerated and keeping the gas exchange operating at its maximum potential. There are other aspects to it. breaking the surface tension with this waterfall type effect. That helps to keep the tank aerated. The bubbles that are rising up from the bottom are definitely adding to water circulation. And of course, water circulation does help in the process of keeping the tank aerated. Those bubbles are putting gases into the water. What that's doing, I'm not entirely sure, but it is definitely putting gases into the water. So ultimately, the long and short of it is, for my level of understanding and for my needs of understanding, again, I don't need to understand all of the ins and outs of how gas exchange works, unless, of course, I'm shooting a video trying to explain to people how all this stuff works. And that's why I'm kind of pointedly telling you that I'm not really shooting that video. I'm shooting you a video explaining that I don't really understand how all that stuff works. But for my needs, all I really need to understand is that if I really want a tank to be well oxygenated and well aerated, then an air stone is going to be my most effective way of doing it. Now, having said all that, there are times where you don't want to use an air stone. If you're injecting your tank with CO2 would be the first example I could think of, the most obvious example. If you're injecting your tank with CO2 and then you put an air stone in there, you're working against yourself. You're off-gassing all of that excess CO2 that you're trying to build up. The efficiency with which the air stone gas exchanges, or exchanges those gases, means that you will never build up an excess of CO2 in your tank if you're cranking an air stone in there and you're just running regular old atmospheric air bubbles through your water. Running atmospheric air through your water can shift your pH depending on how much buffering capacity your water has, depending on how much dissolved CO2 your water already has, whether it's a planted tank, whether it's not a planted tank. Those shifting levels of oxygen and shifting levels of CO2, those can impact your pH in the tank. So there's a lot more going on when you put an air stone in the tank than I ever would have imagined when I first started talking about just put an air stone in your tank, and it makes perfect sense. And, I thought that it was a very simplistic process, and as with most things in life, it turns out to be way, way more complicated than one would first imagine. So, again, that's kind of it for me. I'm done really sort of talking about the air stones. If you want to have the best possible turnover with gas exchange and circulation and all that, get yourself an air stone. They're not necessary, and in some cases they are not even advised. You probably should not use an air stone in certain circumstances, but I will leave that up to you to decide what your particular circumstances are and whether or not an air stone would be good for you to use or not. I have them in some of my tanks that I feel like I need them, this one in particular because of its temperature. I have this tank set to very warm. It's 85 degrees, and at that temperature, the water has a hard time holding oxygen, and so I need to do everything I can to make sure I've got maximum gas exchange. But that's not the case in all of my tanks, and in fact, most of my tanks don't have an air stone, and they function just fine. So they're not necessary, and if you want one in your tank, that'll be up to you to decide, whether you're not, it's a good idea to go in your tank or not. But for me, that's it. I'm done. And if you've got any comments, questions, or anything like that, please feel free to leave them below. But otherwise, I will not be shooting any more videos about this topic. So thanks for watching this one. I hope that helped. And I will see you real soon on the next one. Don't forget, this here is my 20-gallon office tank. Thanks again. I'll see you real soon.